What's up, everybody? Today we are actually doing a faction tier list for all the factions in Squad. So hit the subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below. What is your favorite and least favorite faction to play as? And I've also made this tier list available to the public. It's in the description below if you would like to participate and make your own tier list. This is meant to be pretty casual, so don't take it too seriously. And in fact, this is primarily just based off my opinion or what I enjoy playing. And I'm going to keep the criteria pretty casual and within infantry gameplay, vehicle gameplay, and general gameplay for the faction itself. I want to start with blue 4 factions. So the first one we're going to get is the Australian Defence Force. Probably the main thing that stands out from an infantry perspective with the Australian Defence Force is the fact that they have variable scopes, giving them a ton of flexibility with regards to what environment they can play in and be effective. I think their infantry is pretty solid. Now, from a vehicle perspective, also pretty solid. They have the ASLAV, which is beefy enough and can be great in wolf packs. Plus, they have the M1A1 Abrams. Now, they also have the PMV, which I think is a little bit underrated because it's one of the blue 4 factions that actually has a light vehicle that can carry more than 4 or 5 in it. Now, from a general gameplay perspective, I think that the Australian Defence Force is pretty solid. I would note that they only have one camo, so sometimes on certain maps, they can stand out a little bit more than on others. So with all that in mind, I'm actually going to rate the Australian Defence Force at the B tier as a pretty solid baseline for how the other factions will be built around that. Next, we have the British Armed Forces. Now, this faction needs some love. From an infantry standpoint, they are super limited in terms of scopes and weaponry. They are just not outfitted for close quarter fights. They do have scopes for longer distance fights. They may not be everyone's favorite, but they are suitable. From a vehicle standpoint, rest in peace, the CTAS. Man, I love that thing. Now, the British's main IFV is now the Warrior, which is beefy, but also is magazine-based and lacks stabilization. You, of course, have the Scimitar, the Bulldog, and the Challenger as their main battle tank. From a general gameplay perspective, I think the British Armed Forces do fine on larger to medium-sized maps. Their armor is a pain to kill, their infantry has a little bit more distance capability with their scopes, but just like any other faction, they need to be played to their strengths. But I do think they need a little bit of a refresh, a small update to get them up to speed. So for that, I'm going to be placing them at the D tier, and that's going to be the lowest blue 4 faction. Next, we have the Canadian Armed Forces. From an infantry standpoint, I think they're pretty solid. They kind of remind me in a way of the Australian Defence Force in that they are pretty flexible in terms of how they play, where they play. They have good kits, they have good scopes. From a vehicle perspective, they can be a solid group, especially with the LAV-6. Having those in a wolf pack can be deadly. Some of their light vehicles have a ton of speed, allowing you to spread out infantry. It's a bummer that the TAP V no longer has a 50 cal, but at least you get the GL attached to it. And of course, you have the Leopard, which has seen some recent updates. I have a ton of fun playing the Canadian Armed Forces. From a general gameplay perspective, I don't think there's a lot they can't do. There's some nice variety in the vehicles that the faction operates, plus you have some good flexibility across what you're able to accomplish with this faction. I think this is a good faction all the way around, so I'm going to place this at the A tier on the tier list. Next up, we have the US Army. Now, the US Army infantry may not be anything too flashy, but they are strong and they have solid optics. Now, from a vehicle perspective, you have some variety here in the Strikers with the M2, the 240, and the MGS. You'll have the M2A3 Bradley along with the BFIS variant, and of course, the M1A2 Abrams. And we can't forget about the newer edition being the M113, specifically the mortar carrier variant, which can be devastating for an enemy team to deal with. So from a general gameplay perspective, I think the US Army is pretty strong. Their units are also pretty distinct. I'm going to be placing the US Army at the S tier. I think this is one of the more well-rounded factions in the game, and used to their strengths of each unit, they can be really powerful. Now we have the US Marine Corps. From an infantry perspective, pretty well-rounded, similar to the US Army, just in my opinion. It's nothing flashy, but it is effective. Now, from a vehicle perspective, I think there's a couple interesting points. They have the LAV-25 as their only infantry fighting vehicle. And if you want to carry infantry in some sort of APC, you of course have the AAVC or AAVP. And you can't forget you have Humvees, especially the ones with no doors. But of course, they do have the M1A1 Abrams. From a general gameplay perspective, I think the USMC is fine. I think they're a very strong faction. I just think they need something, and I don't know exactly what it is. So I'm going to be placing the US Marines on the A tier. Now, next up, we have the Red 4 Alliance, which includes the Russian ground forces. This is another group that isn't necessarily always flashy, but it's strong. It's competitive in any environment with a ton of flexibility. I don't like their optics as much as I prefer the optics of the US Army, but I do think they are better than some of the other factions. From a vehicle standpoint, you get a lot of variety, including some of the newly adjusted or added BMPs, everything from the BMP-1AM to the BMP-3. Generally, I think the RGF has a lot of strengths across all of their battle groups, along with a lot of diversity. It's easy for them to run mech infantry assaults and overwhelm you with just firepower via vehicles. And there's a good amount of diversity amongst the different battle groups with this faction. RGF is going to go to the S tier because they are formidable, they have a lot of variety, and they can fit just about any role necessary. Next, we have the other Red 4 faction being the VDV. From an infantry perspective, I've had a ton of fun with the VDV since they were released. While I don't love the red dot on the AK-12, I do enjoy the AK-12, and SLs get a couple GLs to go along with their kit. Not to mention they recently added impact grenades to the faction, which are fun for something different. From a vehicle standpoint, they have my favorite vehicle in the BMD-4, but they also have my least favorite logistics vehicle being the BTRD Logistics, APC. They obviously don't have the same variety of vehicles that the Russian ground forces have, and they're often going to rely pretty heavily on tracked APCs, which may hurt some of their maneuverability on certain maps. Now, I think from a general gameplay perspective, the VDV is pretty strong. I think the RGF takes the cake with a little bit more of their variety across their different battle groups and the vehicle options that they have. But of course, this is a sub-faction of the Russian ground forces, so it sort of makes sense. So I'm going to be placing the Russian airborne forces on the A tier of my tier list. Now let's start talking about the PAC factions, which includes the People's Liberation Army, the PLA Amphibious Ground Force, or the PLA Navy Marine Corps. So let's start with just the PLA. From an infantry perspective, I think the PLA across all of their factions actually have a gun that requires a little bit of time to become accustomed to, specifically around their scopes and how the bullet rifle works for them. But I do feel like their infantry can be pretty effective. Now, from a vehicle perspective, they're pretty formidable. You not only have a transport with a gun mounted on it, but you also have the ZSL with an open top gun mounted on it. You have the wheeled ZBL that'll come equipped with ATGMs, as well as the ZBD, which is their tracked IFV that also comes with ATGMs. And finally the ZTZ, and we can't forget their helicopter, which can hold a ton of people in it. From a general gameplay perspective, the PLA is pretty strong, especially when working in tandem with their vehicles. They just have plenty of flexibility, maneuverability, and some good firepower. Not to mention, they just got some new camo in 8.2, so they have the ability to be a little bit more sneaky. So I'm going to place the PLA at the B tier on my tier list because I do think they are a formidable and relatively strong group. Now, there's a lot of crossover between all the PLA groups, so I'm going to sort of rapid fire between the ground forces and the Marine Corps of the PLA. So first, let's talk about the PLA's amphibious ground forces. The infantry is going to play pretty similar. However, the biggest difference between this and just the PLA is that you're going to start relying very much on tracked vehicles. For example, your wheeled APC in the ZSL turns into the ZSD. You'll also get the ZTD mobile gun system, but frankly, you lose a little bit of that mobility when you start switching to tracked vehicles. However, they are amphibious, so I think there is a time and a place where this faction can be helpful, but with that said, this is probably the faction that I've played the least. If I want to play PLA, I'm typically just going to default probably to the standard PLA over this, and therefore I'm going to put this faction at the C tier of my tier list. Next up, we have the People's Liberation Army Navy Marine Corps. And there's plenty of crossover between the last two versions of the PLA and this one, except for these guys are typically in blue camo. I think there's a solid amount of crossover in terms of their infantry. I will say from a vehicle perspective, you don't get the ZTZ. Instead, you are limited to the ZTD mobile gun system. And this is a faction I don't get to play very often, which is unsurprising because you can typically see them from pretty far away. Now, I would also rate this faction at the C tier, the same as the PLA Amphibious Ground Forces. Because they're fine, they may have a little bit more mobility with their vehicles, but largely it's sort of the same and they're blue. It's time to talk about independent factions, starting with some conventional ones in the Middle Eastern Alliance. Now, the MEA got a little bit of a buff, especially with 8.2 and some of those gunplay changes. Their guns slap, but their optics, along with their weapon, can be a little bit difficult to use, especially maybe in CQB situations, unless you are just a champ at hipfire. The whole faction at large is a pretty tough faction. They are strong with regards to their infantry, and of course, they do have a decent variety in vehicles, everything from an assortment of BRDMs to the BMP-2 to having T-62s and T-72s. Now, from a general gameplay perspective, I do think the MEA is pretty strong. And I think from a general gameplay perspective, I think they can play really well as a defensive unit. So MEA might not be my first choice, but again, I do think they're solid. We're going to be placing them at the B tier on my tier list. Next up, we have the Turkish land forces. The TLF has seen a lot of hate because their rifles tend to be a little bit more difficult to use, especially prior to 8.2. So from an infantry perspective, this was typically not the type of faction that a lot of people wanted to play. And their vehicles weren't overly impressive. The PARS is a little bit weaker than you'd expect, as well as the ACV. And of course, the M60 battle tank also isn't that strong. And in the absence of having infantry hat kits, this became a little bit of an issue. So prior to 8.2, the Turkish land forces were a tough faction to use and typically weren't selected very often. Now, from a general gameplay perspective, it really does seem like the TLF is set up for mech infantry. But the weaponry they were using typically slowed the infantry down, and then the vehicles themselves weren't very strong, so you didn't have a ton of power, but you had a lot of variety. So in some situations, it could lead them to be pretty ineffective. But they could be another faction that thrives a lot on just playing defensively versus being always on the attack. I think some of their recent updates and tweaks have helped a bunch, but I still rank this faction a little bit lower than a lot of the other factions. In fact, I'm going to be placing it on my D tier along with the British Armed Forces. Now let's take a look at the unconventional independent forces, starting with the Insurgent faction, which has been renamed to the Middle Eastern Insurgents. But with that update in 8.2, they also got some new kit variations, giving them a little bit more latitude from an infantry perspective. And whether we're talking about infantry or vehicles, we do know that a lot of their equipment is going to be dated. But for infantry, they do get a couple fun perks, being buddy rallies and multiple habs per fob. But I have to admit, this is not necessarily a faction I tend to run to play infantry, although I do know a lot of folks love this faction, especially when playing Invasion. And I will admit that there is something rewarding about trying to find where you can place explosives and drive them into different vehicles on the enemy team that is kind of rewarding. Now, from a vehicle perspective, they get a bunch of variety, but again, it's all dated equipment, so it just depends on how you utilize it to be effective. There are situations where their vehicles can do a pretty good job at slowing down enemy attacks or picking apart enemy vehicles, just dependent on the situation. And from a general gameplay perspective, you start spreading out those vehicles, putting techies in different positions, trying to rush certain objectives to slow down enemy advances, you can really cause a lot of chaos. While not my favorite faction, I do think there is plenty of opportunity with this group. It's just not something I tend to run to, so I'm going to actually be placing this as C on my tier list. Next, we have the Irregular Militia Forces. From an infantry perspective, they have a ton of weaponry and a bunch of utility, not to mention the variety of emplacements, along with the fact that they have field guns. To some extent, similar to the Insurgents, you can find something to do within the IMF faction that can be fun, or just chaotic for the enemy team to deal with. Now, similar to Insurgents, a lot of their equipment is going to be dated, but they do attack that with just variety, and to some extent, speed with all their techies. From a general gameplay perspective, this faction is super flexible. Again, you have a ton of speed with your techies, you can spread out infantry, and just cause a lot of chaos, especially with some of their AT kits. Spreading out some of your infantry in dense forests, utilizing some of their emplacements, or maybe some grad rocket strikes can be a really effective way of slowing down some conventional forces. Now, while I may not always seek out to play the regular militia, I do tend to have fun with this, and I think some of it is related to the map selection that they have for this faction. So I'm going to be placing them at the B tier of my tier list. Finally, we have the WPMC, or Western Private Military Contractors, a relatively new faction added to Squad this past fall. Just from an infantry perspective, you have a ton of variety in weaponry and optics. This gives pretty much everyone in your squad a ton of flexibility as to what they can play. I mean, some people enjoy the M14, some folks enjoy the MP5, whereas I typically enjoy running the lat kit with the AK and red dot. Now, they don't have an infantry fighting vehicle, which most would seem as a negative. However, they do have a ton of speed across a lot of different light vehicles, giving them the ability to put their lats and hats out in the field to attack those IFVs. Plus, they have a mobile spawn vehicle, and this is the only faction that currently has that available, and that is a powerful tool. Not to mention they have a CAS helicopter, they have a Scout Little Bird, which is helpful if used properly to give in callouts of enemy vehicles, and of course they only have the M60T tank, which is not super strong, but again, they make up for it with their infantry lats and hats. In general gameplay, I think the WPMCs are a really strong faction for fast attacking. Sometimes too fast, they can get in a situation where they don't have steady defense because they're just on the go moving forward. I really enjoy playing as the WPMC faction. It's unique within itself, much like some of the other independent factions. I think it gives you a ton of variety as to how you can play and operate on different maps. So this will be going at the S tier of my faction tier list, along with the US and Russian ground forces. Now that covers all of the factions, and of course I know that there's going to be some disagreements where I've played some of these factions, but again, it comes down to personal preference. What I want to play as, what I have the most fun as, or what I enjoy, and that is all fine. Feel free to fill out your own. It is linked down in the description below, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about where you might switch around some factions on the tier list in the comments below. But with that, thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and I'll see you next time.